Welcome to Bald Guy DIY. In this video, I want to share some ideas with you about energy storage and ask you, what would you make with them? Like pretty much everyone with a DIY mentality, always trying to figure out what kind of project you'd like to make or how you could turn something that you already have into something you need, I always like to collect ideas wherever I go. In fact, I don't need to collect them in the sense of seeking them out. They always seem to find me and catch my attention. One of the things that I've seen over the years, time and time again, is clever ways that people have stored energy without needing a battery or some actual kind of fuel. They found many different ways of storing energy so that it can be used at a later time. If we think specifically about electricity, our most common thought is batteries, that we're going to charge up batteries when we have an electrical supply available, and then we're going to use those batteries to power our device when that electrical supply is not available. Something like our phone, we're going to plug it in and charge it overnight, or when we need a boost on the battery, and then we're going to carry it around and use those batteries because we don't have to be tethered to the wall or to an outlet. Or in some cases, you might have storage batteries for your home or business that are going to run in case you have a power outage, and they're going to be able to supply the electrical loads in the building. Some real creative people have found ways to store energy in other forms and then to be able to use that energy at a later time to make a machine work or to be able to produce electricity. I want to share some of those ideas with you today and then ask you, what would you create as an alternative storage besides something just as a battery that could be useful in a DIY project? So without further ado, let me share some of these ideas with you. The first method I want to talk about when it comes to storing energy is to use gravity. If you haven't thought of this before, it probably seems like a strange concept, but anything that's lifted up to a certain height has potential energy that's released when that object falls. So if you wanted to use gravity or that potential energy as a way to store up energy to be used later, you'd simply need to move an object, preferably one with a lot of mass, to a higher level, lift it up in the air, and then have an ability for it to travel back down to the ground and release that energy, converting it into something that could be usable motion or some kind of turbine action that would create electricity. Lots of different ways that it could be used, but the main idea is that you're going to use the potential energy stored up by lifting something up at height and use that to hold the energy in place until you need to use it. A few years ago, when my family and I traveled to Newfoundland, Canada, and saw an old lighthouse, one of the things that was really cool to me is that they didn't have a way of powering the lighthouse as far as the main light to spin around and around. What they did was create a mechanism where the lighthouse operator could crank up a weight, and that weight would go all the way to the top of the lighthouse, and then as it would work itself down, over a period of hours, I think it was like 2 to 4 hours, then it would cause the lighthouse light to rotate until that energy was exhausted. Then every time it had reached the bottom, it would be up to the operator to go back into the lighthouse, crank it back up to the top again, and repeat that process over and over again. The earliest designs only lasted a short time, like I say, maybe a couple hours, maybe up to 4 hours. But as they figured out how to use mechanical advantage more and more, they were able to increase that time, maybe a full 8 hours, so that it only had to be cranked a few times a day. These are very creative solutions, and like all inventions, sort of born of necessity, because electricity was not always readily available. They'd use some kind of fuel to make the light for the lighthouse, and then they'd use this mechanical advantage in order to actually make the light rotate. That kind of creativity we don't use a lot today because it might seem like electricity is more plentiful, but those are the kinds of things that could still be of great advantage. When you think about the types of alternative energy sources that we have today, it's things like solar and wind power. So if you were able to generate electricity either during the day when the sun was shining or when the wind is blowing, you're going to be able to use that energy, of course, as it's being created. But if you don't have a battery to store it up, is there another way you could do it? Well, using the idea of a gravity or potential energy storage, you could indeed. What if you were to take a body of water and pump it up to a higher reservoir while you were able to produce electricity using some kind of electrical pump, and then in times where you weren't able to produce electricity, be able to drain that reservoir back through a turbine and then be able to once again produce electricity when you actually need it. If you really think about it, every hydroelectric dam is basically doing this same thing. It's storing up the potential energy of the water and then releasing it in a nice consistent flow so that the dam can produce a stable form of electricity that's not dependent on the height of the river and how fast it's flowing at that particular time of year. It's really a gravity battery that makes it all possible. We were able to tour the Hoover Dam a few years ago. It was incredible to see the lake that they had produced by creating this huge dam and how they were able to release that water when they needed it in order to create extra help for the power grid. In today's world, they don't use the Hoover Dam at its full capacity, but they have that stored energy available in the form of the potential energy of the water that can produce electricity when they need it to supplement the grid. Another form of stored energy is to use something called spring tension. And this goes way back as well to the time before electricity and batteries were readily available. People created all sorts of wind-up spring tension devices. Something as simple as a clock or even a wristwatch that you would have to crank up or wind maybe several times a day, maybe once a day, whatever the frequency was required, and that would store up energy that would then be released until the clock was depleted to keep time. Just like the idea of putting something above the earth in order to have potential energy, when we put compression on a spring, we're also creating some stored energy that will be released if we allow that spring to move. And that's basically how the idea of all these wind-up devices work. If you think of something like a wind-up toy or even one of those cars that you would have to pull back on the carpet and then release to let it go, what you're really doing is storing up energy inside those springs and then releasing it when you actually let it be expressed. As batteries have become more readily available, that's been our go-to option, but springs have also become much more readily available. And so I'm curious, is there a way to use springs more today than we have in the past to create some really cool devices that would store up energy to be used at a later time? Even with the idea of alternative energy sources with electricity, when that wind turbine's blowing or the solar power is being generated from the sun, would it be possible to be winding up a giant spring that would be under compression until the time that you needed the electricity, at which case you would run it through a series of gears or turbines in order to create electricity that when you want it on demand? I think that kind of potential really exists, and it's something that in a DIY capacity would be a lot of fun to explore. The last idea I want to share with you is an idea of how you could store electricity essentially in another form. Some really creative architects and engineers have come up with ideas in modern buildings to store electricity in ice. That might sound incredibly foreign and unlikely, but what they've done is to reduce the electrical load during the day when electricity is more expensive and where it puts more strain on the electrical system. They've created a system that will freeze water into blocks of ice during the night when electricity is less in demand and when it's cheaper. That way, during the day, all they need to do is blow air across the ice and it cools the air enough in a building in order to produce an air conditioning that requires far less electricity during the day. In essence, what they've done is store that energy in ice. That sounds particularly counterintuitive because ice is not energy. In fact, it's the absence of energy. But in this case, what you're storing is actually an energy deficit. And when you use that store, you're going to be subtracting the heat from the building and exchanging it for cooler air. And so those are three ways that people have used to store energy and use it at a later time using techniques or methods that have been around for a very long time. So my question for you today is, as a DIYer, is there a way that we can use alternate forms of energy storage in order to power our projects? Perhaps we have some home electricity generation, or we have an ability to be tied to the grid for some of our time, but not for others. Is there a way that we could create an alternate energy source that could power our projects? Maybe when we're camping or when we're away from home. Different things like that. Is there a way to use gravity batteries or spring compression or ice or any of these other kind of methods in order to provide energy we need on the go whenever we need it? Please let me know your ideas in the comments or send me an email. My information's in the description below. If you like this kind of content, Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and check back regularly as I post a new video every week with all sorts of DIY projects, electrical tips, and anything else that interests me at the time. Thank you to all the people that have subscribed so far. We're right close to the 2,000 subscriber mark, and that's all because of the people that have found the channel and supported it so far. That's all I have for you in this video, but remember, in all your DIY projects, don't be afraid to be bolder.